all, I just love skiing, like so much. There's nothing in the world that brings me more joy ever.
Scared to death right now, but I've got this. Like, I know deep down inside I'm capable of what I'm about to do.
I felt like the rehab was pretty simple and straightforward, and I learned how to appreciate my body and how to take care of it, what to eat and like to stretch. I was 18, so I felt like I was invincible at the time.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Athletic Stance Podcast, a skier's perspective with your host, yours truly, Scott Chrisman. In this podcast, I have made it my job to go out and interview skiers at the highest level of the sport, to explore their perspective on life, what shaped and influenced them to become the person they are, and a whole lot more. First, let's take a look at our sponsors, because without them, none of this is possible. Our first sponsor is Northwest Tech. If you haven't heard of them yet, you're missing out. They hand make customizable 3-layer outerwear to order in the Pacific Northwest. And that means you know that it keeps you warm, dry, and looking unique while you're sending it around the mountain. They've been generous enough to give me a coupon code for my listeners. Use the code AOS75 to get $75 off any custom piece of outerwear. Their site is in the show notes. This episode is brought to you by POC. POC makes the best helmets, goggles, and protective wear out there. They've been dedicated to protecting athletes since day one, and I wouldn't wear a different helmet, goggle, back pad, or hip pads. With their spin technology and VPD system, there are no other products on the market that are like it. Definitely go and check out POCsports.com and protect yourself today.
Well, I talk too much anyways in my intros, so without further ado, Mike Wilson.
I just was like, fuck it, and I stayed tucked and I jumped as hard as I could off the jump. And as soon as I took off, I knew I was screwed. I don't even remember, to be honest, I don't remember being in the air. I remember taking off and I remember landing. Like I blacked out for the middle of the jump. I remember, bracing to hit and hitting and, and everything else about before and after, but I don't remember being in the air. But like considering the laundry list of injuries I had partial tears in both my knees. I broke my back in 3 places. I collapsed my lungs. I was bleeding. My kidneys were bleeding into my urine stream. So I was peeing blood and coughing up blood for 3 or 4 days. It sounded like a super, super gnarly injury, but like all of the compression fractures in my back were pretty minor. And I actually had a couple of them from beforehand. The doctors were like, it looks like you've got a broken back, but it looks like it's been broken before because there's a lot of scar tissue in there. Can you think of a time that you would have hurt your back before? And I was like, yeah, I know exactly when I did it. So I re-broke my back. The tears on my knees and my ACLs were really the only thing that could have been a game changer. And I went to, a bunch of different doctors. I went to doctors in, Truckee, in Tahoe. Then I went down to Reno. Then I went to South Lake Tahoe. Then I went to San Francisco. Then I went to Colorado. Then I went to Boston. I ended up going to 7 different knee surgeons before I found one that didn't want to operate on both my knees. And Vern Cooley, who's one of the head guys in Park City. Yeah, I'm sure you know Cooley.
He's super awesome.
So Cooley was the first one who didn't want to do my knees, and everybody else looked at it and they just said, look, like you tore your ACLs. It's not fully torn, but you've got like 20% each one. If you weren't doing what you're doing, we may not want to operate on them. Like they would say, if you're as an athlete, we would still recommend that you just replace both your ACLs. But if you were just an average everyday person, you could probably get away without it. But certainly as a pro skier, you need to have them both replaced because otherwise you're going to get on snow next year and you're going to blow them both out the first week skiing, and then you're going to be super pissed. So they were like, right now it's the beginning of summer. Let's go ahead and replace both ACLs. And I basically was like, an ACL is kind of like, that's the end of your career as a professional skier. At least the end of when you're comfortable pushing yourself, I don't know whether it's a mental thing or a physical thing for most guys, but most people, once they blow their knee the first time, they still ski well, but they don't push themselves the way that they used to. And I was just like, I'm not having that. That's not, that's not me. Yeah. So I basically kept going to doctors until I found Cooley, Cooley's partner, I went to the Stedman Clinic in Colorado and they wanted to do both my knees. I went to Terry Orr in South Lake Tahoe and he wanted to do both my knees. And Cooley finally was just like, he joked about it at first. I said, what do you think? And he said, I don't want to operate on you. And I was like, you don't? And he was like, no. And he was like, I'm already booked out like 2.5 months. So he was like, if I operate on you, it means I'm missing my lunch break. Yeah. And I was like, okay. And I'm like, but do I, what's your take on it? And he said, you know what? I'd rather see you rehab it for 6 weeks and see how much strength you can get back and, come back in 6 weeks. And he was like, worst case scenario, we have to operate anyway, and you lose it and you're looking at 6 months to heal. He was like, slightly better. You spend 6 weeks rehabbing right now. You go into the surgery that much stronger. And he was like, you end up rehabbing it and you're good to go in 5 months instead of 6, which means you're only losing 2 weeks. And he was like, best case scenario, you're able to regain most of the strength and you get to the point where you're comfortable that you don't need surgery and you dodge a bullet entirely. And I looked at him, I said, you're my doctor. That's what I wanted to hear. I wanted somebody who was, basically going to tell me I didn't need knee surgery and I was going to keep going to doctors until I found one who did.
Yep.
And Cooley was right. I ended up, I didn't go back after 6 weeks. 6 weeks, I was feeling a lot stronger, but I felt like I was getting a lot stronger every day. So I ended up spending 10 weeks rehabbing, doing a lot of physical therapy, a lot of biking, road biking, 6 or 8 hours a day.
Yep.
And, really just training as hard as I could. And I went back after 10 weeks and he said, well, how does that feel? And I said, it feels like it did, to begin with. And I was like, my knees feel fine. I was like, I'm still having issues with my heels because they aren't fully healed yet. But, I'm getting to the point where I can walk comfortably again. And I don't feel like it's not my knees that are bothering me. And he shot a few more MRIs and he said, cool, let's not do the knee surgery then. And I skied, 7 or 8 more years as hard as anybody on my knees and never blew them.
Yep.
So thanks to Vern Cooley, I kept my ACLs and didn't have, I made it through 15 years of professional skiing and hammering on my knees pretty hard without ever blowing my ACL and needing an ACL surgery.
Yeah.
Thanks to him. So, but I guess back to, the mentality of it was that like when it came down to it, I started skiing again about 3 months. It was like 3 months and 3 or 4 days after my accident was when I started skiing again. And I wasn't, obviously wasn't at 100%. I still had a lot of scar tissue in my heels and a lot of other things that I needed to break down. But I was able to spend about a month skiing up at Mount Hood before Mount Hood closed. And then, I had 2 months off in the fall to rehab again and recover before ski season hit. And it was during those 2 months that I started base jumping. And, I just turned 18 right before I got hurt. And so that was, a few months later. And it was one of those things that like, base jumping was amazing for me because all of a sudden my passion for being in the air, it was safer the bigger I went rather than being exponentially more dangerous.
Yep.
It becomes exponentially safer. So, base jumping, immediately grabbed hold of me. And mentally, I think that helped me get over any worries that I had with skiing. But also the fact that I was 18, I was young, I was super healthy, super fit, all of the, for how bad things were, they were all actually pretty minor injuries. The fact that I blew both my knees, but didn't need a knee surgery. I broke my back in 3 places, but didn't need to do anything for it. I was coughing up and peeing blood, but I just waited 2 weeks and I felt fine. So it was kind of like everything just kind of went away on its own. So for me mentally, I came back from that. And I think that a lot of people, their first major injury is a blown knee, which is a 6-month surgery, and you're super laid up. It's, it's really painful. And I wouldn't say that what I had was less painful. But, like I said, I mean, most of the pain had gone away in 2 to 3 weeks. And, I was walking again at 8 to 10 weeks and skiing again at 12 or 13. So most people who are looking at 6 months from their, their first major accident, it gives them a lot more time to doubt the strength in their leg and to have the head games and to worry about it. And for me, it was just like, there really wasn't any doubt. I was just like, oh, okay, cool. I'm already skiing again. I'm going to be good. I'm fine for this winter, and I think part of it is just because I came back so quickly. And, because I was young and healthy and everything. But yeah, I just mentally, it didn't even occur to me that, that could have been a career ending injury.
Yep.
And there was never really any doubt whether I was going to, come back and ski hard or do anything. And then when I, took up, base jumping, all of a sudden I was just like, dude, I'm going to go even bigger, than ever before. And, because my passion about flying and being in the air just got even bigger and bigger. And so I was just like, all I want to do is hit huge jumps. So mentally on that one, I think I just saw it as an inconvenience more than an injury. The same way that I don't know, guys fall and jam their wrist, that was the same kind of way that I viewed that. It wasn't like I didn't think of it as a major injury or a setback or anything. The jump in Utah when we were out hitting chads, when I overshot it, was kind of the opposite. I'm sure everybody's seen the footage of Tanner,
Yep.
Shattering his heels and ankles on that. So I was the first crew to hit it after him. So he hit it, and then it had gone unhit for 5 years. And I decided I wanted to go back and hit the jump. I hit it 2 times before, once when I was 16 or 17, and again, 2 years later when I was 18 or 19. And at that point which was, I think, the year before Tanner hit it. Was the last time I'd hit it. So at that point I was 23, 24, something like that. And again, and Chad's gap, everyone says is a 120-foot gap. If you measure it out, it measures between 85 and 95 feet, depending on where you put the takeoff. It's not actually that big of a jump. That said, the way that the wind blows the snow in every year changes it. So, the change of the build changes according to the snow and the snow conditions every year. And so I was hitting that with Tim Durchie, and Bjorn Linus was there as a snowboarder, and Dan Breesy. And so the 4 of us kind of built the jump, and I basically was like, look at the angle of the landing and the direction of the landing. And the way that the snow had blown in that year was a little weird, so we couldn't put the takeoff off to the side the way that Tanner and Yoon had built it. But we had to run it more straight down the mountain rather than across, which is, I don't know if it's good or bad. It means that you end up with a high speed drop and compression right before the jump, maybe 50 or 60 feet before the jump. So when you're at full speed, there's all of a sudden there's a huge compression that you have to hit. So you kind of air off that land, and all of a sudden you've got 40 feet before you take off for this big gap jump. So with the way that it was built, I wanted to try to chop that compression down a little bit, fill in below it, and then take the whole takeoff up and make the whole takeoff 4 feet taller and add a bunch more pop to it. Basically, because the landing was so steep compared to the jump that I just didn't like the way that the angles were matching up. Yeah. And, I got outvoted. Everybody else was just like, no, dude, this is the same way that we've built this jump for years. We were there with Steve Rosendahl and, a couple of the still photographers who I'm pretty sure have been on every single Chad's mission that has ever existed. And those guys were like, this is the way we've always done it, blah, 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 blah. And I was like, yeah, but like, I don't know if the landing has changed, from previous years, but I was like, I don't remember it being like this, but right now the angles don't look to me like they match up.
Yep.
And so when we started hitting it, I got outvoted, and basically I was like, well, I'm not going first. I'm like, if you guys want to hit it the way it is, somebody else has to hit it first. I was like, otherwise you can let me build it the way I want to, and I'll go first. And so Tim Durkee wanted to hit it the way it was. So he decided to go first, and he hit it. And his first jump, he jumped to probably, 50 or 60 feet past the landing. And so he landed kind of right where it starts to flatten out a little bit below the landing, and landed and blew up. And, I did the same thing. I went from just below where he had dropped in, but I think I popped a little bit harder, and I went about 10 or 15 feet past him. And, I cleared basically directly over his bomb hole and created one just past it. So we were slowly, slowing down the amount of speed that we had. But it was weird. Like, Durkee did a couple of cork 10s, and he had one that he like cleared the knuckle by like 2 feet and was able to put his feet down, like, within 6 or 8 feet of the knuckle. And then he had another one where he cleared it by probably 3 feet, but when he reached down, his feet couldn't quite touch down. And he probably soared another 40 feet before he actually hit. Yeah. Just by being a foot higher.
Totally.
And so, I was like, and he crashed on, 4 or 5 1080s, and I mean, he was doing them perfectly, right to his feet every time, but the speed, the amount of time he was in the air was so inconsistent, even though the speed was dialed. And that was just because the angles didn't match up like I had, like what I wanted. So I was like, kind of having a hard time with it. And then we went home at the end of the day. It snowed again that night. We got like 2 feet of fresh snow. So when we showed up the next day, I started trying to shovel all the snow and put more pop on the jump and build it up a little bit more, and then started to step up the in run. So Tim had gone up the in run, and I put more snow on the takeoff, tried to build a little bit more pop on it. And then when I went up, I cleaned up the in run all the way to the top to where I was comfortable with it. And then I was kind of being lazy. I was like, well, while I'm here, I'm just going to wait. So Tim said the jump was good to go. And so I came in, did one speed check, and could see that he had taken all of the snow I'd added to the takeoff off again. And so I went back up to the top, and I was like, if we don't have the additional pop, I was like, I want more speed than what I just had, because I think that'll put me under the wall. But instead of sidestepping all the way up and flattening it out, I just, hiked up, another 100 feet past that and just skied straight through the POW.
Yep.
And I guess I didn't really think about, how much more speed I was going to have. But Durkee had put a little bit more lip on it when I hiked back up the second time. And as I came down, between having more speed than I needed and having a lot more pop, all of a sudden I just went flying past the landing. So I went to rock a nice big backflip. And I mean, most people have seen it. I peaked like 30 feet above the knuckle. And I was pretty much finished with my backflip already. Yeah. And I kind of just, opened up, kicked, and just hot tubbed it into my back. And I landed if it's a 120-foot jump, I would have landed at like 220 feet, which means I probably landed at like 150, 160 feet, because it's actually nowhere near that big. Yep. But maybe I did. I don't know. I landed somewhere between 150, 170 feet. I way out jumped it. But again, that day it was we finally got the pop a little bit better. It still wasn't as much as I wanted, but then again, it became a game of slowing down the speed to figure out how fast to go, and I think we only got 3 or 4 hits that day before Tim came up short on it, and I don't remember exactly what he did. I remember him saying he broke his back because he came up short on it immediately, like wasn't moving. I dropped in from just above the jump where I'd been hiking up, skied over to him immediately. I try to support him, have him not move. We ended up getting him onto a backboard, getting him down to the hospital. And I mean, I was pretty sure when he was in the hospital, he said he had broken his back. But then I know he was in Alaska like a month later. So I don't know, whether it was something like what I had, or whether he was in Alaska and just wasn't skiing, or what the deal was. But that one wasn't really a conscious thing to like, when we out jumped that landing, the two times that we went, huge on it, it wasn't necessarily like I don't know. I think a bit of it was just that, like, all I could think of was it was my first time hitting it since we'd rebuilt it, either the first time we did it or when we rebuilt it. And I was just like, all I could think of was Tanner's ankles. Yeah. And so I was just like, I can go too big on this thing all day long, but if I come up short on it, it's, my season's over. So I was just like, I'm going to go too big and fly past the landing. And then I'm going to, step back, down my speed back until I've got the right speed. And, and that's kind of what Dirty and I were both doing. I mean, we both started out going way too big on it and dialing it back. And, his, the only thing that I was bummed about was that the session ended, with him in the hospital, and that I didn't get the shots that I wanted, because when I took him down to the hospital, and when I came back up to hit it the next day, a bunch of guys had taken shovels and torn the whole jump apart. And I was like, what the fuck? Like, I've spent 6 days building this jump, it's not up to you to decide to destroy it.
Yep.
And, I got a bunch of backlash from that, because people were like, well, your buddy's in the hospital, were you really going to hit the jump again? And so people thought I was being, insensitive and being a jerk about it. And I kind of was just like, I mean, maybe I'm being a jerk, but it was the same thing to me as like when Derek Spong came up short on the jump in at Mount Shasta, and he was in open heart surgery for like 2 weeks. And I went back the day after he hit it and went back and murdered that jump. And Taylor Felton ended up hitting it with me and a bunch of other guys. And at first everybody was like, there's no way I'm even going up today. They were just like, our friend is having heart surgery because he came up short on a gap jump. And I just went back, rebuilt the jump, and hit it that afternoon, because I was just like, well, I'm not going to let this jump get the best of us.
Yep.
So I kind of had the same mentality at Chad's too. And, I was a little bit disappointed when other people decided it wasn't up to me to decide whether I wanted to keep hitting the jump or not.
Yeah.
Dude, you're a beast. This is crazy to hear these stories. That's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Were you ever given, like, it seems like you draw a ton of power from within. Like, you just are, like, know who you are, know what you want to do, and go out and accomplish it. And, like, were you ever given any advice? Is there anything that, like, anything that you've read in a book that has inspired you to be this person? Like, what has created, obviously I think a lot of it is like you were saying, you were so young at the super park sessions and stuff like that. Like, obviously that's going to breed a badass person, but is there some piece of advice, some mantra that you've lived by, any?
I don't know that I would say there's a quote or a book or any specific thing. I think that it was more like, I am the way I am because of the way I was raised. And it goes back to, my mom and dad both being very, I don't want to say lenient, because that's not the right word, but open to my fun. I've always liked jumping off stuff. And, when I was a little kid, I was hitting bike jumps in the backyard and hitting, jumps on cross country skis before I even started skiing. I actually grew up snowboarding before I started skiing. So I was hitting jumps on my snowboard in the backyard and, hitting jumps on my BMX bike as a kid. And I remember my mom came home from the dump one day. She'd been doing a dump run, getting rid of a bunch of stuff because we lived in the middle of nowhere in Vermont. So dump runs were kind of like load all of the trash from the last, couple of months into the car and trailer and head to the dump. And my mom came home with a whole bunch of mattresses. And there was like a 4-H camp or a Boy Scout camp, a couple hours away that was getting all new mattresses. And they're all solid foam mattresses rather than spring. So I basically, like, my mom brought home, I don't remember what it was, 28 or 34 or something like that, but basically a ton of mattresses that were, 4 or 6 inches thick and 3 feet wide and 5 feet long, that I could put anywhere. So, when I first started backflipping, when I decided I wanted to backflip my BMX bike, I, took mattresses, put out 2 mattresses on the top of the landing, one, kind of past the landing, and basically built, something so that I could land on it. And if I, chucked the bike or whatever, landed on my head, I would have, some cushion there. But if I landed on it and stuck it, I'd still be able to land and ride away from it.
Yep.
So it was kind of like, I wouldn't say I grew up with a foam pit, but kind of pre-foam pit. I was one of the first kids to have that kind of, access to that kind of training. And, like parents with the mentality that was okay.
Yeah.
And then, when I signed with Line, Mike Nick and Jason Leventhal obviously were, very quickly became the guys that I looked up to. It's kind of funny because I was born in the same town in Vermont that Ross Powers is from. So even when I first started skiing for Line, I still figured at some point I was going to grow up to be a pro snowboarder like Ross. But I just I got to follow Mike Nick and Jason Leventhal around, and Jason's probably, he's like a wizard when it comes to skiing. He just sees things that nobody else does. And, he knows what's right for the sport and what's right for his company. And, if what's right for if what's right for the sport isn't what's right for his company, then he tells somebody else to go do it. He says, hey, this needs to happen, but it's not something I need to be a part of. I'm not going to put my effort into it. But otherwise, if the two align, there's no better power to have on your side than Jason Leventhal.
Yeah.
And I owe my entire career to him. The guy's absolutely incredible. And Mike Nick is the other one. And those guys were just a powerhouse. And, I spent 5 years, from 11 to 16 when Mike retired. I was chasing him around every day. And we'd go up, we'd ride, my parents pulled me out of school so I could ski for the winter every year. So I had 3 or 4 months a year where I would just ski, all day, every day with a bunch of other pro skiers. And, that really helped me with the training. But even when I got off the hill, Mike would come over to the house and bounce on my trampoline with me for 2 or 3 hours. And we'd learn new tricks together or work on different grabs or different tricks with different grabs and trying to understand the biomechanics of, off-axis air awareness and aerial rotations, the difference between a D-spin with a mute grab and a tail grab or a, leading tail versus a regular tail. What happens when you drop one shoulder versus drop the other shoulder? What do you have to do between the set and the rest of the rotation to make sure that the rotation happens the same and puts you to your feet? So it was a lot of training stuff like that. And I don't know. I guess I would say that, having those guys on my side, I literally, until I was 18, I don't think I ever really even viewed skiing as work. Like I was getting paid to ski and it was my job full time, 100%. But I just went skiing and I had fun with it. And Jason Leventhal made it super fun for me. And, it was only really like after, the last year that I skied for him started to become a little bit more difficult because I had so many people pulling me in so many different directions. And that was really because of the double cork.
Yep.
And, all of a sudden everybody wanted me to be in movies and do this and that and whatever. And as far as, who I am, I think it's really more the way I was raised than any one quote or anything else. I think that, my dad instilled a lot of things athletically into me. I don't know whether he realized it or not. He was a very competitive athlete when he was younger. So I think he kind of was just, summing up things that he had learned into little lessons for me, but I'm not sure that he ever, realized how much of it I was going to take to heart.
Yep.
But it was, little things like when I was, 6 or 7 years old playing soccer, and one of the fastest kids in my class, had the ball and started running, and my dad was like, catch him. And I was like, I don't know if I can. He's the fastest kid in the class. And my dad was like, yeah, but if he's got to worry about dribbling a soccer ball, he can't possibly run as fast as he can. And you've got to be able to catch him. And, from that day forward, I've never let anybody be faster than me. And, just decided that I was going to run as hard as I can and always be the fastest guy. And, it's like stupid little things like that just kind of keep up with you, I think another thing that probably helped is I have an older sister who's 4 years older than me. And so growing up in rural Vermont, there weren't a ton of other kids around. So I grew up, playing with a few friends who were my age, but mostly looking up to my sister and her friends who were 4 years older than me. Yep. And, when I'm trying to compete with athletes, when I was 6 and they're 10, obviously those guys are a lot stronger. They've got a lot more experience. They're a lot smarter than I am. But, I tried to understand why they were doing what they were doing, how they were doing it, and what I could do. Technically, they would take away their physical advantages. And so I think that made a huge difference. And I think one other thing, and it kind of happened later for me in life, but when I was a sophomore in high school, so I was a 15, I think. I was in school at the winter sports school and met my physics teacher, Dave. And Dave changed my whole life. And I'd always been very interested in learning how things worked, but I didn't know that, at that point I was, I would look at a jump and I would, I would know how fast to hit it because I would compare it to, 10 or 20 other jumps that I'd hit that were roughly the same size and shape. And then I'd say, okay, this is how fast I had to go into those. This is how fast I have to go into this one. And when I walked into Dave Seeger's physics class, the very first day, he basically introduced us to, the three main principles of physics, Newton's laws. And, an object in motion stays in motion, blah, 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 blah. And I think at first it was me being a smartass, but I said, give me a real life example of this, and teaching at a ski academy. He said, all right, Mike, an object in motion stays in motion unless an equal and opposite force reacts upon it. This means that you can't do a 360 one way and a 360 the other way in the same jump. And I said, okay. And he said, and I was like, what about, the other ones? And so he gave me real life examples. And then he started explaining some of the formulas that we could use to calculate, all of the trajectories and different things like that. And before we left class, like the last thing he said before we left class that day, he said, if any of you guys can prove any of these theories wrong, you get an automatic A in my class. Knowing that we couldn't and it would never happen, but also knowing that if for some reason somebody was able to, he'd be a millionaire, math teacher. So I came into school the next day with a video of me doing a 360 one way and a 360 the other way in the same jump. I went out to the water ramps where I was coaching and training, and I did a triple backflip, and I did a backflip 360 to my left, and then a straight backflip, and then a backflip 360 to my right. And so I came into school the next day with a video, and I was like, so how you said I can't do a 360 one way and a 360 the other way in the same jump? And he was like, okay. And I showed him the video, and he was like, all right. And I was like, you owe me an A. And he was like, all right. And he was like, you've got your A. And he was like, but I have a feeling you're going to come to class anyways.
Yep.
And I was like, absolutely. I'm like, this is the coolest shit I've ever heard. This is amazing.
Yeah.
And
totally.
so my high school physics class was really one of the things that opened my eyes to, mathematically calculating, what I was doing. And not necessarily always, like, I don't have to figure out, the actual math on stuff because we don't live in a vacuum. So most of those formulas aren't taking, wind resistance and atmospheric pressure into account, or any other friction or anything like that. So they give you a rough idea. And, if you calculate it and you say, oh, this one's 10% faster than this other jump, you'll know that you need to go roughly 10% faster.
Yep.
Rather than knowing exactly how fast 52 miles an hour is, you just know that it's, a little bit faster than 45.
Yep.
But the real thing I learned is, kind of how to match the angles on jumps, and, you know, to pull from past experiences and compare and contrast, and, you know, always try to be learning from your experiences rather than just experiencing.
Yeah.
So I would say that those are really the things that kind of shaped me into who I am. Were really that high school physics class was massive. You know, I mean, like when I was 12 and 13, you know, living in California with Jay and Mike Nick and traveling and skiing all the time. I mean, I'm kind of like the little kid who was raised by wolves, you know. I was 11, Mike Nick was 21, Jason Leventhal was 25, I think, at first. And I lived with those guys for 5 or 6 years, pretty much, you know, between, I guess, you know, first things in order, just growing up with an older sibling and trying to, you know, keep up with her and compete with her and her friends. And then having parents who, you know, allowed me to do that and promoted it. I shouldn't say promoted, but just kind of allowed it and were okay with it. And they were comfortable with, you know, my antics. And then, you know, to meeting Jay and Mike Nick and growing up with those guys and, you know, the rest of the line team with Chris Turpin and Skogan Sprang and Eric Pollard and Dash. I mean, we just had like Mike LaRoche, like the whole family was, I mean, it's kind of funny because it's like, those are the guys that, you know, most skiers grew up looking up to. And I grew up, I mean, I don't even think I realized that I looked up to Mike and Jay at that point. They were just my buddies. You know, I looked up to Ross Powers and I looked up to Danny Cass because someday I was still going to be a pro snowboarder. So those were the guys that were like my heroes, where Jay and Mike were just my friends. Yeah. And I think that maybe that has something to do with my mentality as well. The fact that I didn't realize how lucky I was to you know, to have friends like that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was just normal. It was the norm.
Yeah, I mean, my other friends, like, I mean, I know normal kids have, you know, friends their age come over for dinner, but like my mom would be like, hey, you know, what are you guys doing, you know, after skiing today? You know, should I make tacos? And Mike Nick is a huge pizza and taco guy. So he's like, if Bev Wilson is making tacos, I'm coming for dinner.
Yeah.
And the next thing you know, we'd have the whole team there, you know, and I mean, even the Vermont crew, before we even, you know, went out west with Reg Puri and Pete Mithofer and Luke Banley and everybody, you know, we'd end up with 8 or 9 pro skiers at my house once or twice a week for dinner.
Yep.
And my parents loved it, you know, and I don't think I realized what it was going to do. I mean, I do remember the conversation with my dad when Jason first told my dad he wanted to sponsor me. My dad was like, oh, great. You know, what snowboard company do you work for? And my dad and Jay looked at him and was like, I own a ski company. And my dad was like, well, you know, my son's a snowboarder, right? He's only been skiing for a couple of weeks. And Jason was like, yeah, but I want to sponsor him and see what we can do. And, you know, I think he's got potential because he fucking runs his mouth like it's his job. And when I called him out, he backed it up. So, you know, I think he's coachable and, you know, I'd like to see what we can do. And so my dad pulled me aside and he said, you know, what do you think? And he was like, you know, this could be a pretty drastic change to your life. You know, rather than going to normal school, you know, you might end up going to a ski academy where your school is focused around skiing. And you know, maybe like, and I mean, both my parents and aunts and uncles and my whole family went to college, and my dad was like, you know, and so for me, like, it was never a question of when I went to college, you know, it was kind of which college I was going to go to. And my dad was like, you know, if skiing really takes a huge part in your life, it's like, you might be kind of the first person in your family not to go to college. And I was like, ooh, don't say that. You know, of course I'm going to go to college. And, so it was an interesting conversation because my dad was like, you know, do you realize how much this could change your life? And I was just thinking, I'm like, Jason wants to pay me $2,000 to ski for him for the rest of the year, which is only like 3 months. And I'm like, you know, as an 11-year-old, you know how much candy I can buy with $2,000? I'm like, shut up, Dad, just sign the contract. I'm like, yeah. I know it's going to change my life. Just sign the contract. And, you know, looking back on it now, I'm like, well, I did go to a ski academy. My life did revolve around skiing. I didn't go to college because I was busy skiing. You know, I went back to school as a 25-year-old freshman, and made it I made it like 2 terms and dropped back out of school and was like, I'm not ready to give up having fun to go to school.
Yep.
But it was definitely, definitely a different lifestyle. And that was a turning point for sure.
Yeah. Man, dude, talking to you is epic. This is so much fun for me. I remember I went to Romark Ski Academy because I grew up racing. And I remember I was probably 15 at the time. They were doing a ski swap. And I remember sitting in the office because someone had to be in the office. I forget why. But my friend Dylan Jasinski was like, dude, I got this movie, Ski Porn. You should watch it. It's awesome. And I remember watching it and being like, I don't even want to race anymore. Like, what am I doing right now? This is ridiculous. Like, that is what I want to do. And unfortunately, it took me, 2 or 3 more years to actually make that transition to doing that. But it's pretty awesome being able to have this conversation with you now and hearing like how you went through the whole progression of it, and just like from that to having your own TV show, circumnavigating Iceland and scuba diving, and dude, all of it. It's like it's awesome.
Right on.
Super
awesome. It's been a fun ride, that's for sure.
Totally.
So you went to Romark, huh?
Yeah.
What brought you out there?
I was pretty good at racing. I was, 3rd in the nation for my age, or 2nd in the nation for my age. I don't even remember at this point, but up there when I was like 13 and 14, and my dad came to me and was kind of like, if you really want to make something of this, we should probably get you in a ski academy. So I went out to Steamboat, to Lowell Whiteman, and checked that out. Loved the idea of going there. And then went out to Romark and checked out, or I don't know that I ever went out and checked out Romark. I had a coach, David Kerwin, who coached for the U.S. ski team for a while, and then he ended up being the head coach over at Romark, and he was my coach out at Mount Hood. And I went to Mount Hood summer ski camps, and I was this 13, 14-year-old kid who was the fastest kid at camp, pretty much. And Kerwin, really enjoyed my mentality. And the funny thing was I would get done racing and I'd go down in my this is a side note, but I'd go down in my speed suit shorts, or like maybe not even wearing shorts. And I knew the guys who ran the park from Mount Hood summer ski camps, so I'd roll through the park and throw 360s both ways, like in my speed suit with my backpack on and everything.
Yeah, on the way down at the end of the day?
Yep, totally.
Yep. I remember being at Hood and watching all of the racers come down. That's how John Sims got into free skiing. He came from a racing background as well. Yep. He was up at Mount Hood and was always just cruising around, and at the end of race training, he would hang out for a few more hours and hit the park. And everyone was like, all the coaches and everybody and his sponsors were like, don't do that. You're going to get hurt,
Yep.
Like it's too risky. And he's like, yeah, but it's fun.
Right. But I'm having fun. Same thing for me. And then like we would go and there's like a 6 foot half pipe, and I'd learn how to drop in on a skateboard, and, ended up starting skating, and they'd take us cliff jumping and everything. But, Dave
at the punch bowl.
Yep, totally. Yep.
Awesome.
But Dave Kerwin ended up inviting me to come out to Austria. He was going out to coach camp in Austria, and then that turned into like the camp, or whoever he was going to be with kind of fell through. And so it was just me one-on-one with Dave Kerwin. I was training with the Slovenian World Cup team, Europa Cup team. I don't even remember. I was like 15 years old. Flew it on the airplane with Lindsey Vonn. She's, I'm 15. She's like 16 or 17, and like the most attractive woman I've ever seen. And we show up and do dry land, and Dave Kerwin and I ended up playing badminton for whatever reason. I don't like at the hotel across the way had a volleyball net, and he found, I think he went looking for a volleyball, couldn't find a volleyball, so he found like badminton stuff. So him and I ended up playing badminton for a couple hours at this net, and Romark Ski Academy showed up at that hotel. It was kind of across the way from where we were. He, I think, started talking to Romark at that point, and that was, I think I was 14 when I went out to Austria with him for the first time, and he started talking to Romark Ski Academy because he wasn't quite sure what he was doing. He had undergone some pretty big life changes, and he, I think that year, ended up the head ski coach for Romark Ski Academy. So I kind of naturally, it was in between Lowell Whiteman and Romark, but I loved what Kerwin was doing for my racing, and he really helped toughen me up. I was a little bit of like a soft kid when I was younger, a little emotional in some ways, and he really helped toughen me up. And so I was like, you know what, I think I want to go out to Romark, spend time with Kerwin. And
when you've got a coach and it's a winning team, stick with it.
Exactly. Yep. And so I went out to Romark, and my dad has MS, so he's been in a wheelchair or used a cane since I was 8. Then was in a electric wheelchair for a little bit. Now he's pretty much mainly in a manual chair when he's out, but he was able to move out to Salt Lake City with me and spent my last 2 years, even though my parents were together. They dedicated that time to making me
that's awesome,
best athlete that I could possibly be. And that's kind of how I ended up at Romark, man. I'm getting all these flashbacks. I remember riding the lift or the gondola or tram at Hitztal in Austria. I remember riding it with like God, who was the Austrian at the time? I forget his name. Benjamin Reich. Riding it with him, and riding the tram with Julia Mancuso and Ted Ligety and a couple of these other people. And it's like, man, I was right there for a couple years, and then Romark actually kind of ended up being the death of my ski racing career instead of the platform that really pushed me. I kind of isolated myself there, and it was hard for me to relate to a lot of the athletes. I did not get big for a while. I weighed 115 pounds when I graduated high school at 6.
Yeah.
I was a twig. So
Jesus.
Yeah, like I was still, scoring in the 40s, ski racing points wise, which is pretty good, especially for like what how big I was. But I just never, I never put on weight, and that was, turned 18, didn't make the US ski team, fell off the map for a little bit, and was like, dude, skiing is what I love. Skiing is what gives me passion. I'm going to go back out and make a career out of it and free ride. And, certainly I'm still chasing some of those still chasing making a career out of it in a lot of ways. But, yeah, man.
It's hard, man. Like, people ask me all the time, like, what I did that allowed me to get to where I did in skiing. And I'm like, I don't think I did anything. I'm like, really, Jason Leventhal was the one who found me. I was in the right place at the right time. He made my job easy because he needed a young kid to promote his junior skis. I mean, which he didn't even make at the time. He started making junior skis because he sponsored me. Yeah. But he needed somebody to a young kid to help promote his brand, and so he made he did all of the legwork and the hard stuff for me, and he made it super fun. And I'm like, I mean, if I look at what kids have to do now, like there's so much competition, so many good kids. There isn't more money in the sport than there was before, but there are a million more kids who deserve it. And I'm like, I might have been good enough, to ride the way that these kids do, but I don't have anywhere near the work ethic that all of them have. Like there's no way I would be a pro skier if I had to do it again right now. No way.
Yep.
So yeah. I do not envy you or anybody else in that position.
Yeah. I mean, for me at this point, like with Andre Regatli throwing the quad cork and everything, like I think that there's a giant separation between the main meat and potatoes of what drives the skiing economy, which I think is mainly tourism and tourists, and what the pros are doing. I think back 15 years ago or 20 years ago, there was a way to relate what the pros were doing to what the tourists were doing in some way. It still was probably unattainable for a lot of the tourism population.
Yeah, but I think that you're right. Like they have a better concept as to what the pros were doing, where now they just look at it and they're like, I can't relate to that in any way, shape, or form, so it doesn't make any sense to me. Yeah,
totally. So I'm trying to bring it back to, like, I do a webisode series now called Ski-nanigans, which is just all about having fun. And like, yeah, I push the sport, push my level in the sport, doing double flips and stuff like that. But it's not, I'm not out there necessarily gunning for a quad cork or, I work out in the gym all the time. What are you going to say?
I was just laughing because not to bad talk anybody else, but I don't think anybody should be doing a quad cork unless you're hitting a 250-foot table.
Yeah.
I mean, like the only reason I did the double cork initially was it was at the US Open, and it was like there was a period, I don't know if you remember, but for like 3 or 4 years where pretty much every major contest was won with a switch 1080.
Yep, totally.
And I was just tired of the switch 1080 scheme. And so I showed up to that event with a switch cork 1080, and that was what I was planning on competing with. And there were 32 people from slopestyle who qualified for the Big Air because they run Big Air head-to-head in the US Open.
Yep.
So there's 32 people who qualified for Big Air, and I got 8th in slopestyle, so I was the 8th person to drop. And Tanner got 7th. He was right in front of me. And the first 6 guys dropped in, and all through switch 1080s. And Tanner looked at me and goes, looks like it's going to be a switch 1080 party. And I was like, are you doing a cab 10? He was like, yeah. And I'm like, I just shook my head and I was like, what the fuck? I'm like, because I think a big part of it, well, there were a lot of things. One, I wasn't into that. Like, I didn't want to do the same thing as everybody else. But bigger than that was like, even if I had won a contest with my switch 1080, there's still going to be so many people who are like, well, I didn't like his style. I think that this person should have won. And I never wanted to compete or try to win a contest, where people would argue that I shouldn't have won. If I was going to win a contest, I wanted everyone to be like, yeah, he fucking outskied everybody. He won that event. No questions asked.
Yep.
And so when Tanner dropped in and did the 7th cab 10 in a row, I was just like, dude, I'm not doing it. So I just did a cork 7. And I basically did it so the rotation that I did, the double cork, was an underflip 540 to a switch rodeo 540, or an underflip to a misty flip.
Yep, totally.
So when I did my cork 7, I basically did like an underflip 540, like a super corked out underflip 540 into a late 180.
Yep, totally.
And so basically I did one cork 7 on my first jump because we had 2 jumps to qualify for the head-to-head rounds, or to seed yourself for the head-to-head round. And I basically did the first cork 7 just to feel the rotation on that jump on the takeoff and know basically, when I was going to be peaking and how long I had until I peaked. And I mean, I'd never even done the trick before, but I kind of picked up the concept from playing video games with a buddy like a couple of months before that, and they'd been rattling around in my head that it could be done, but I hadn't done it. And so basically, I just when I actually did the double cork, I wasn't even thinking about doing a double cork. I just basically was like, the jump is 65 or 70 feet long. I'm gonna land at like 75 feet, but my second rotation is going to happen a little slower than the first. So basically, if it's a 70-foot jump, I want my first rotation done when I'm peaking, and then I'm going to drop a little bit more than that, and that'll make up for the slower second rotation.
Yep.
So I was like, I basically have 30 feet to do an underflip. So I'm going to set this rotation like I'm doing an underflip on a 30-foot table.
Yep.
And so I dropped in, and I dropped in through a underflip style cork 5, leading hand safety, because that's the grab that I normally did with that, and then just naturally switch to the other safety to drop my other shoulder into the second rotation.
Yeah.
And that was how I did the first double cork. And it was like, it wasn't, about doing something groundbreaking. I mean, it was more just because I didn't want to do what everybody else was doing.
Yep.
But I certainly now I watch people and all of these double corks, and even like when I was on Chad's Gap with Tim Durkee, he was like, yeah, I just double cork 1080'd it. And I was like, he didn't even get uncorked. So I was like, it's not really a double cork. I'm like, it's kind of just a cork 1080. Like, there's so many kids now doing double corks and triple corks. And I'm like, well, first of all, your last rotation was a backflip or a mogul flip. It wasn't even corked, I don't know if you'll agree. Well, I guess you'll agree, but I don't know if you can see my fork, but basically, like, if this is a front flip and this is a back flip,
yep.
If you do a side flip, that's a Lincoln loop.
Yep.
If you do a flip at a 45-degree angle, we call that a mogul flip, because it's a fully inverted trick. It's not a back flip, but it's, halfway between a Lincoln loop and a back flip. But when they first said that they were going to allow off-axis rotations in the moguls, there were a few guys who started doing flat 3s in the bumps, and most people saw what they were doing but couldn't do it, so they just started doing like crooked backflips, and they called that a flat 3. And so everybody in free skiing just started calling it a mogul flip, because we knew that it wasn't a flat 3.
Yep.
So now there are all these kids who are doing mogul flips, calling them flat 3s and saying it's off axis. And I'm like, it's not even off axis. That's a 45-degree angle on axis rotation.
Yep.
So it's interesting. Like, I mean, I was actually thinking about this the other day, like, talking to aerial coaches and stuff, about free ski tricks, and aerial coaches will always tell you that a D-spin is a bad back full. And I would say that a D-spin and a back full are similar. A bad back full is not necessarily a D-spin, but a D-spin is a bad back full.
Yep.
If that makes sense.
Oh yeah.
Like a D-spin, the rotation of a D-spin is a bad backflip 360. But a bad backflip 360 doesn't necessarily make it a D-spin. That makes it a bad back full. It can also be a cork 7, or it could be a ton of different rotations, and it doesn't even have to be a cork 7. Like the way that Tom Wallish does his D-spins, it's more of like a Lincoln loop. He basically does a side flip 360. His feet are never traveling around him, so he's not actually getting corked. He's doing a straight over side flip with a 360, which means that his cork 7 isn't even actually a corked rotation.
Yep.
And there are so many kids now who are doing double corks and triple corks and working on quads who don't even understand the biomechanics of the off-axis rotations to begin with. And I mean, Yoon Olsen didn't help that one when he started doing the kangaroo flip. And it was one of those things that I kind of like had to, I had a choice. I had to bite my tongue or call him out on it. And, when I first started doing double corks, Yoon and everybody else, were like, that's crazy. It's insane. it's risky, it's too dangerous, it's whatever. And I'm like, well, sure, because the first one I did was, 2 off-axis flips with a 1080, so with 3 spins, where Yoon's first double cork that isn't corked, that's a double 45-degree rotation with a 180 on the end, and that's 2 flips with one half rotation. But when he started doing it, I was like, dude, you can't call that a double cork. It's not you're not even doing a cork. You're doing a double mogul flip with a late 180 on it. But at the same time, I knew that if double corks were going to catch on, it needed a simple double cork like that for anybody to ever start doing it and to catch on. So I was kind of like, I can either call him out and try to explain that he's doing it wrong and that he's not even paying attention to the fact that his double cork isn't even corked. Or I can kind of let it slide and hopefully more people will start doing bigger tricks like this. So that was a kind of an interesting thing to see happen in skiing, but it's weird that when he started doing the double cork and the kangaroo flip is, I know exactly how he invented it. He went to Australia. I learned it on the water ramps because he and I had talked about how I had been jumping on the water ramps and training there for a couple of years. So he decided to go down to Australia midwinter and try to learn a double cork. And all he did was he took off at doing a double backflip Japan grab. And by dropping, his right or left shoulder, I think he spins left. So it would be dropping his right shoulder to grab with his right hand. But just by dropping that shoulder, it automatically rolls your feet off to the side. So your first flip will be mostly straight. You might rotate it 10 or 15 degrees off axis. The second one is going to be 30 to 45 degrees off axis, or not off axis, but off heading. Yeah. And then it naturally will put you down sideways or backwards. And that's the biomechanics of flipping and spinning. That happens when you weight one side of the body more than the other side. When one side stays bigger and one side gets smaller, one side starts to spin in the rotation.
Yep.
So he basically started doing double backflip Japan grabs, and it naturally spun him around. But I think that the aerial coaches there, because they don't really understand off-axis rotations, so those guys were like, yeah, that you're definitely corked, in the same sense that all the mogul skiers were saying that their flat 3 was corked, even though it wasn't. It was still on axis. So Yoon came back with a double on-axis trick, calling it a double cork. And now there's a million kids running around doing double corks that aren't corked. A lot of them aren't even ever getting uncorked, which means it's not a double. It's just a cork 1080 or a cork 1260. And they don't understand, the biomechanics or the rotation that they're doing. They're just putting names to it.
Yeah. I think in the sport, people just decided once your head goes under that axis twice, it's a double cork,
Yeah, exactly. Whether you get off axis and then back on axis and then back off axis or whatever, it's and I don't really know what to call it, because you are doing a double rotation and you are corked, or most of the time you're corked. You aren't ever corked in a kangaroo flip. But at least not in the ones that Yoon and Jakob were doing. I've seen other people do a mogul flip to a more of a rodeo 5 rather than a mogul flip to mogul flip 180.
Yeah. Totally.
And at least they're getting corked in the second one. But yeah, I don't know. So when you're laughing about how some kids are trying to do quad corks, I'm like, nobody's even doing a quad cork because they might get one or two of the rotations who are corked. The other 2 are straight up on axis. They're basically getting back to aerials. They're mixing our sport with aerials.
Yep.
And I think actually a lot of kids could benefit from spending more time on a trampoline and trying to understand the biomechanics of, off-axis rotations rather than on-axis rotations. There's a lot of kids coming into free skiing with gymnastics backgrounds and diving backgrounds, and they're good in the air. But, having that background is almost, can be bad for you. Nick Gepper's a perfect example. He's really, really good in the air. I wouldn't say he has necessarily a super strong gymnastics background, but he definitely is much more comfortable flipping on axis than off. So he does, his double corks for a lot of them aren't even really corked. Or at least the second rotation very rarely is. And I love Nick. He's one of my favorite people. I love skiing with him. I love riding with him. He's a super great dude. And I'm not talking shit about him. He's just got a different style. But he's definitely one of the top guys in this movement of kids who I feel like I feel like I'm talking shit, but like they don't know what they're talking about. They're saying that they're doing tricks when that's not actually the trick that they're doing.
Yeah, totally. I think there's just a mislabeling that's happened in a broad spectrum in the sport, where it's just been accepted that if your head goes under your feet, it's an off-axis or corked rotation, which isn't true at all. And I think, I think that's the point that you're trying to make. And I think a lot of people.
Yeah, there's a difference between a cork and an invert.
Yeah,
I think is the biggest thing. And people just say, oh, I did a double cork. And I'm like, well, you did a double inverted whatever, but, was it actually corked? You have to look at what cork means. It means off axis. Off axis is off axis. If it's just because you're flipping on a weird axis doesn't make it off axis. It just means you're flipping on a 30 degree or 45 degree axis, as opposed to 0, which would be a front flip or back flip, or 90, which would be like a side flip.
Education.
Yeah, and then another big part about it is that like there are so few people who are coaching free skiing who actually grew up doing it. Like I'm one of the first guys who grew up free skiing, and I'm 31. Yeah. So there aren't a whole lot of coaches who are going to be older than me who grew up doing it. And unless you grew up doing it or have spent time, really studying the rotation, it's hard to understand, hard to explain and hard to understand what makes it corked and what makes it, inverted, and what the different biomechanics are. I mean, I remember having this conversation a million times with Clay Beck when he was around, and a lot of the other, like Mick Berry, who was the head coach in Park City, and a bunch of those guys at the water amps, because, they would watch, like they would see people do a Barani, which is a front flip 180, and they would call it a Misty flip. And I'm like, well, it's not a Misty flip. A Misty flip looks a lot like a Barani, but a Misty flip is an off-axis rotation. So your feet will go over your head, but your hips and shoulders and head should all be at roughly the same plane. Your head should never be below your hips. So you're inverted in the sense that your head is below your feet because your feet are traveling over you, but your hips and your shoulders stay flat. You should be traveling, over your back. And in that sense, it's definitely not a Barani, or a front flip 180, where you do like a Barani, you basically do a half of a front flip, a 180, and a half back flip down.
Yep.
And so trying to explain the biomechanics of that. And so, another thing was when I was coaching at the water amps in Park City, people would always say, all right, so this is how you do, a cork 7. This is how you set it. And I'm like, well, it depends on what grab you're doing.
Yeah.
And they were like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, yeah, that's what you're going to do if you're not doing a grab, or if you're leading with this shoulder. And I'm like, but if you try to set it like that and do a mute grab, you're going to, land leaning forward and go skyrocketing off the trampoline. And they're like, well, why would you do that? I'm setting the rotation. And I was like, I know, but I'm changing the shape of the object that's rotating by changing the grab, which when you change the object or the shape of the object that's rotating, you change the rotation that the object is going to do, which means that you're going to have to set the rotation slightly differently to be able to do the same rotation. And a lot of people don't I don't know if they just didn't grasp that concept or still don't grasp that concept, but I think that there are a lot of coaches who are coaching it who don't know how to explain that. And there are a lot of kids who are doing it who don't understand that. And that, I think, also leads to a lot of things being misnamed.
Yeah, totally. And then you have, a site like New Schoolers where like you have so many different people that are like all across the board who just like, who are like 12 to 15 or 16, 17-year-old boys who just want to troll, on the internet and be like, that was this, that was that, whatever. And that, I think there's just there hasn't ever been anyone that's like, actually, this is a cork, this is I mean, but it's just not a broad spectrum umbrella, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I'm with you. I kind of feel like I should do that, actually. Just talk to somebody at New Schoolers, be like, let's sit down and do it like you and I are doing, like a Skype call or Zoom or whatever the app is. Just say, look, we're going to sit down, we're going to watch some videos, and we're going to discuss what the tricks are, and we're going to post them saying, this is a D-spin, this is a cork 7. Can you see the difference? Well, let's talk about it. What is the difference?
Yeah.
A D-spin is a cork 7. A cork 7 is not necessarily a D-spin, in the same sense that, a bad back full isn't necessarily a D-spin, but a D-spin could be, considered a bad back full. Yeah. I think it's a better back full, but
right.
I think that would actually help quite a bit. Just, to clear up a lot of the, naming and labeling of tricks. And I think that you'll see a lot of kids' style change to try to actually do the tricks that they were saying they were doing, or there'll be new names created for it,
Yeah.
I mean, and like, I know that it's weird because a lot of people are like, well, I did a double flip and the first one was corked, so what am I supposed to call that? I'm not going to call it a cork 7 to backflip or cork 7 to mogul flip. And I mean, to me, I kind of feel like that's what you call it. If you're not actually getting corked in both rotations, you can't call, and you need to get corked in the first rotation, uncorked, corked in the second rotation, and uncorked to land. That's a double cork. And if you're only corked in one rotation and not the other one, then it's a backflip to, cork 7, or a cork 7 to a backflip, or whatever the rotation may be. But you need to name that rotation, and not just call it a double cork or a triple cork or whatever.
Yeah.
And then you get into the other side where people are staying corked the whole time and not even coming out of it, but their head dips below them twice. And, there needs to be a name for that. Which like what Dirty was doing on Chad's Gap, where he said it was a double cork. And I'm like, you never really got uncorked. You stayed corked the whole time. So it's just a cork 1080, not a double cork 1080. But yeah, he got, super corked, then less corked, then more corked. I don't know what you call that, a wobble or I did a double wobble, or whatever it is. But there needs to either be people either need to clean up their style so that they're not doing that, or they need to figure out a new name for it so that they can name it correctly.
Yeah, totally. Let's open up the conversation. I guess we are right now, but yeah. No, I totally get that. And I kind of gave up on trying to like call people out or explain what a trick was, because so many people, just didn't understand it. And I'd try and explain, this is what this means and this is what that means. And then at some point I just kind of let it go and was like, if your head went under your feet, sure, call it a cork, because that's kind of the standard of the industry.
Because that's how everybody else does, because they don't know what they're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I don't have the authority or, to necessarily tell people the same way that I think you could step in and be like, hey guys, actually.
I invented it. I think I know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to be that guy though. Like, that was part of why I didn't say anything when Yoon was doing them. Like, I was like, I think that any of it's good for the sport.
Yep.
Anybody who's doing something unique and different and bringing their own style to it. But I would like people to look at the rotation that they're doing and, and be able to identify it.
Yeah.
Which is funny because actually I think one of my favorite things ever when I was younger, I'm trying to remember how old I was. I was, I don't know, 15 or 16 up at Timberline before summertime with Eric Pollard. And and Pollard threw like 5 or 6 super unique rotations off of this, like, wasn't really a full hip, but like a slight hipped landing on a table. And he threw like 4 or 5 super unique rotations that I'd never seen before and I've never seen since. And I mean, he probably did 7 or 8, and I think he crashed on, 2, 3, 4 of them. But he did a couple of rotations that were super unique and landed really weird. And all the photographers were like, Pollard, they're like, what trick are you going to do this time? And he's like, I'm, a 540. And they're like, oh, what 540? Like, is it a Misty, a rodeo, a flat spin, what? And he's just like, I don't know. He's like, I'm just going to go up and I'm going to, do something weird in the air and I'm going to rotate 1.5 times. And that's what makes it a 540. So it was cool because he kind of was like, it was a big park feature. It wasn't like a super soft pow landing or anything like that, but he was, I think trying to do some of the tricks he was doing on a snowboard on skis. So he was setting rotations very differently from skiers, and it made for really unique rotations, the way a lot of the old Japanese guys used to rotate. And it was super cool to watch, but I love the fact that everyone is like, well, what trick is it? And he was like, it's a 540. And they were like, well, which one? And he was like, I don't know. It's a 540. So I do remember that because I thought it was so cool. He's just like, I don't know. I'm just going to try to learn a new trick. I don't know what it is yet. So he's like, once you get a picture of it, show me a sequence of it, and we'll figure out what the rotation was that I just did.
Yep.
But I feel like kids aren't doing that these days. They're they see the name and they set out to do a named trick rather than to just create a rotation and then figure out what it is afterwards. Or maybe that's what they need to do. They need to try to learn a trick, and then once they do it, rather than saying that that's what they did, they need to look at the video and see whether that's actually what they did or whether they did something different.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, man, I think super interesting discussion. I love it, and I hope that it spurs more discussion in the sport. One person that I think of that I really think is doing a lot of, I don't know that he necessarily comes uncorked, I guess, but has a very different style. Henrik Harlow with his, with his triples and stuff. They're so much different than like Bobby Brown's triple, which Bobby Brown's triple, like, I don't even know. I think maybe his first rotation is off axis, and then the second 2 are on. The third one is definitely just a straight over backflip. And he does like a cork 7 to like a mogul flip to a backflip. Exactly, totally.
And that's the same, pretty much the exact same rotation that I did. Well, the first double cork or the first triple that I did a cork 7 to like backflip 180 to front flip 180. And then I started trying to get the last flip more corked by like rolling my shoulder in and making it more of a Misty. And I kept landing and hip checking. And so then I decided to try to get the second rotation more corked. So I was trying to go like cork 7 to flat 3. And I would go cork 7, and it ended up becoming basically like the mogul flip and then backflipping out of it.
Yep.
And that's when I gave up with triples, because I was just like, I'm never going to get a triple where I'm actually staying off axis on all 3 rotations. I can't even do it where I'm off axis on the first one and the last one.
Yep.
So that's when I gave up, trying to do triple corks.
Yeah.
But that's why, again, that's part of why I think it's funny that, kids are running around saying they're doing triple corks. I'm like, no, only one of those. Yeah, exactly. You're doing a single cork triple invert, like there are a million different ways to name it, I mean, kind of like in a gymnastics or aerials background, you can call it a back full, you can call it a backflip with a 360, you can call it a backflip with a full twist or a full spin or whatever, there's a million names for it. They all mean the same thing.
Yep.
You can do the same thing with free skiing, but you just need to be a little bit more specific than calling it a double cork, especially when what you're doing isn't a corked rotation, getting uncorked and then corked again, because that's what a double cork is.
Yeah, totally. Man, love this conversation because it's something that I've had on the back of my mind for the longest time, and I'm like, well, I'll just write it off and let people call it whatever. But I think you can call it a triple, but just don't call it a triple cork. you know?
Yeah, it's exactly. And that's the thing is like, there's room for other names, you know? I'm not saying that you can't call it, you know, I mean, fuck, make up your own name. If you're Bobby Brown was the first person to do it. So you shouldn't be calling it a triple cork. You should be calling it a cork 7, a mogul flip to backflip, or, you know, put a name on it the same way that you can put, you know, a kangaroo flip on a double mogul flip 180, you know, give it its own name.
Yeah, for sure. Call it the, you know, like for Bobby Brown, call it the Cali flip or whatever. I think he did it out in California, or, you know, like call it, you know.
I think his first ones were done at Squat, my home ski area.
Yep.
So, you know, well, I mean, or fuck, name it after himself, you know, whatever you want. I mean, whatever you want. First person to do it, you get to name it. But, I mean, the other thing is you need to make sure that you're the first person to do it, and that, you know, what you're doing is what you're saying it is, and that it's never been done before.
Yep.
You know, you'll look like a bit of an idiot if you start doing, you know, I mean, if you do the same trick that somebody else has done, even though you think what you're doing is slightly different.
Yep. Yeah. Totally, man. Well,
it's funny to think about park skiing again, because like all I've been thinking about for the last like 2 years has basically been, you know, more. I mean, to be honest, mostly snowboarding, POW, and you know, like big mountain or all around skiing. But you know, I don't even know. I think the last time I rode in a park, I think I took a few laps through Jackson Hole Park last year, but the last time I actually rode park was probably 7 or 8 years ago. It's been a while.
Yeah.
I don't know. I did it for long enough. I feel like I'm still allowed to have an opinion about it, you know?
Oh yeah. I mean, you're allowed to have an opinion and an authoritative opinion on any of this, in my humble opinion. But
thank you.
yeah, man. I think a lot of people will have a lot of fun listening to this conversation. I hope. But you know,
they're gonna be like, "Why is Mike just rambling so much?"
I don't know. I think there's a lot of people that'll really enjoy it. Who knows?